watch myself. I'm just like, oh.
Have nothing to do?
Well, to be fair, sometimes I want to see how I'm teaching, because a lot of teaching you guys think is saying stuff, but a lot of it's about trying to anticipate questions you're going to ask, or try to fix problems before they happen, or trying to bring people in. And so I watch to try to critique myself so I can get better. And sometimes I just like to watch myself and I'm like, wow, he's really good. All right. But to get back to the point that Cole was talking about, the paragraph ought to be the same size. You do want to make sure that you keep in mind that the American Revolution, the idea of American independence in terms of economic independence, remember, how much were Americans smuggling over the years? A ton, right? They were ignoring the navigation laws 100 years before this happened, right? They hated Edmund Andros. They hated the Dominion New England, right? They disregarded the Molasses Act, the triangular trade. So this has been going on for a while. So while Brett's thing was really good, I think he can get a lot. I think Brett's was going to be stronger, like analysis-wise, sort of like what you're talking about. I think there are other ways to organize that we can bring in more evidence. And if you can analyze both, I think number 2 is an essay that if you do a good job, this is one of those ones where if you're good, you can cap out at 115. I mean, yeah, you can really rock this. This is a follow-up question.
Yeah, about number 2.
Okay. Hold on, because you were not able to do that.
Is there any would you recommend any kind of way to organize number 2?
No, I mean, I don't know what I would do necessarily. I probably would do it time-wise. You can't do it politically, economically, and socially, right? Because it's asking you about economics. The patterns of time, I probably would look at it somewhere like everything before the Treaty of Paris that ended the French-Indian War, and then from like that time up until, obviously I'll probably do that up and then the Stamp Act, and then everything else. Right? The Stamp Act can probably be a gigantic paragraph to its own. There's so much analysis going on there. There's so much that's going on with the Stamp Act and the questions, the back and forth, the Sons of Liberty, the Stamp Act Congress, all of it, right? Especially on top of, because in the first paragraph, I would probably want to mention the Albany Congress and people coming together, right? Another Stamp Act Congress on top of that during the Stamp Act fiasco as a sort of a phenomenon of colonies coming together. And then I'll probably do everything, and I would sort of like, I don't know how I would actually, what I would say the last mini thesis would be or something, but it would be sort of like everything else, right? Probably I would focus more on the Tea Act and Coercive Act stuff, although the Townsend Acts were really important. What I might actually do is look at how Americans reacted and maybe could organize on how Americans reacted. Like early on it was smuggling, then it was organization with the Stamp Act, and it was just pure pissed off after that. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, don't write pure pissed off. That's not really I think. So you can do it that way, right? Yeah, you could have how Americans were affected, how they reacted to it, and then what they did. You could do that too. Really anything that's going to help you organize it. But remember, don't come into tomorrow. All of these things will be fine. And you can use the same evidence in all of these. Just don't come in tomorrow not having an idea of what you're going to do. If I was studying for this, since you're like, that's what I do. If I were you guys, if I was studying, in fact, when I was you, what I would do when I had this in college is I knew what all my theses were going to be. Not word for word, but basically I knew what my theses were going to be. I knew what my organization was going to be. Not word for word, but how I wanted to essentially do this, right? I was confident enough that I could form coherent thoughts while I was writing, right? And then I wanted to make sure I knew the evidence. And once I had that, I didn't try to overdo it. A lot of you guys spend a lot of time really making sure you're memorizing all this stuff. I just want to make sure I knew the history, I knew what direction I wanted to go, and I knew my thesis. If that was the case, and I like tests, alright, so I always felt good during tests. Some of you guys panic during tests. For some of you like tests, and it's like a calm comes over you, right? And I like that. I like tests. I was confident enough that I could form coherent sentences and argue. If you're not like that, if tests freak you out, then the more prepared you are, the better you'll feel when you come in, right? If the tests are your nirvana, then whatever.
So can you do like the? I'm just like I know you said we can't do anything, but I just want to make sure this sounds okay. Like the beginning acts of Parliament, and then like the Stamp Act, and then the last one's before the Revolution.
If you like. Now, be careful when you are running your mini thesis. You're not like, and then there was everything else, right? I mean, each paragraph has to try to prove something. But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to look at what was left and say, you know, after the Stamp Act, it was a matter of time until. You know, the British government, blah, 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 and then argue that, that's fine. But you have to, all of them have to make sense somehow, right? They have to go together somehow, and that's fine. So, in all these essays, so long as you have a good, solid thesis, each mini thesis is, or topic sentence is focused, and it's arguing something, and you've got good analysis. Also, transitions. I'll use Taylor as an example. Essay Taylor wrote the other day, at the first part, she was like, and then this happened, and then this, and then this, and then this. But then by the end, she was really transitioning from one thing to the next, right? So transitioning from, she was doing the Puritan one, right? And so she was like, Puritans were this, and then anti-Hutchinson was this. But then eventually she was like, and then she was like, you know, and as society went on, there was disagreements in the clergy. An example of this was the Great Awakening crisis. Well, that's a great transition, right? You're transitioning into it, and it flows, and you get more stuff out of it. Because it's all coming together and one thing connects, right? That's how you form analysis. But if you're like, and Hutchinson was this, and Roger Williams was this, and Thomas Hooker was this, then that's hard to analyze. You're just telling me stuff. And you got a lot better at that. And that's what's going to eventually, at the end of the year, hopefully all of us will be moving in that direction. Yes?
Mary said at one point she had an essay that was just like nothing but hardcore facts, but there was so much evidence there that you were like, it's an awful essay, but I can't give you back grade for it as much crap you memorized.
Yes, that sometimes happens. In fact, and it's funny, I'm sure she won't mind me saying this, Elle used to have phenomenally high essay scores, and sometimes they weren't even that good. I mean, Elle was a phenomenal writer. In fact, she's one of the best writers I've ever had. And of course, Mary's Mary. But some of Elle's, actually Elle and Laura Welch's and Mary, some of their best essays, scoring-wise, were some of their worst written essays. But they just knew all of history, right? And based on what I said I was going to score, I couldn't just lie about it. I asked Miles about it. Miles used to always say he always felt like his best days were the worst scored and his worst essays were the best scored. By the end of the year, they were all doing both, and that's really what hopefully we're going to get into. And it's a process, right? You're not only perfect, it's the second test. You guys are asking the right questions, so that's good. Other questions? Oh, Taylor, you had a question, sorry.
On 3, I'm having a hard time thinking about how to organize it and put down the right evidence. Because I feel like the evidence I'm going to put down for is going to be all wrong.
Okay, well, let's look at it then. What evidence is there for the assertion that basic principles of the Constitution were firmly grounded in the political and religious experience of America's colonial and revolutionary periods? Okay. What?
When you read it like that, it sounds so hard.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you what you can do. I'll tell you what I would do. If the question said, what evidence is there for the assertion of the basic principles of the American government, of the basic principles of America after the Constitution were rooted in the democratic and religious experience of the colonial and revolutionary periods, I would agree with it. I actually would probably disagree with this. Or I probably would say something like, while the political experiences were reminiscent of revolutionary colonial experiences, the religious one was not. And here's why I say that. Where's God in the Constitution?
He's not.
It's not. In fact, the First Amendment separates church and state. Now, don't we have just a smurf ton of evidence that America had a lot of religious tolerance, a lot of different religions, and all these things?
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? So you can either make the argument that, you can say the argument that because of religious toleration, you could agree, okay, we have a history of religious toleration, and then you can give a whole big thing about religious toleration and agreeing with it, and that's fine. So if you wanted to use religious toleration in the First Amendment, then that's great. And we have tons and tons of evidence about religious toleration. We also have lots of evidence when people weren't particularly religiously tolerant either, and the government was combined with religion, right? Covenant theology and stuff. So you can go either way on this. If you're dealing with religious toleration, then you can go back to the dissenters and the Quakers and the Act of Toleration and the Great Awakening becoming more democratic and all of those experienced religiously. And, you know, Catholics coming over and Jews coming over and Methodists and Baptists and Quakers and Puritans and all that stuff. Or you can say we weren't religiously tolerant because we had, you know, the witch trials, right? And we had covenant theology and all this other stuff. Or you can say they were, and you can bring up again Roger Williams and liberty of conscience and all these great things. So maybe that would be easier. Maybe I would do that. Politically speaking, look at all the stuff. Didn't every colony have an executive branch, right? A governor? It was appointed, right? So a governor. They had legislatures that were partly voted on, right? They had a lot of democratic experience, starting with the Mayflower Compact, the Fundamental Orders, all these things. This is a lot of the colonial stuff we're talking about. And then you can start talking about also things in the Revolutionary period, like the pre with this, with like the Albany Conference, right? And then the Stamp Act Congress, and then the First Continental Congress, and then the Committees of Correspondence, and all these political actions. I probably would have a whole paragraph about just the religious toleration of America and how that was rooted in the First Amendment. And then I probably would have several paragraphs about politics. Probably one about, specifically, I would look at one that was more logistical, about how some of the executive, judicial, and legislative ideas were in the colonies or in the local government. And then I might have one just about democratic ideas, right? Where the colonists just participated in democratic ideas, right? And then they got used to being together. And that's where I would talk about things like Albany Congress, Stamp Act Congress, First Continental Congress. Because isn't the Massachusetts Circular Letter, isn't the Boston Tea Party, aren't all these things political, right? Isn't it just like, that's protesting, right? That's a really big deal, right? And so you can even talk about that with freedom of speech, because you talk about John Peter Zinger case, freedom of press, right? All the protesting with that, all the non-importation stuff, the association, the non-exportation, the non-consumption, all of that. This is an essay where if you get all that stuff and you really get it together and analyze it, I mean, honestly, I think essay 2 and 3 should be baller essays. I think essay number 4 would be the easiest to write, but I think it might be the hardest to get a really high grade on because there's just not as much stuff. I mean, you can compare the two, but there's limited. The first one, I think you can be the most creative on, but I suppose it's the hardest one. Do what? Yeah, it might be more about analysis. I mean, there definitely is evidence out there, but this is easier to analyze just because it sort of sets itself up to analyze. But that's, I guess, what I would do. I'd probably have the whole lot about the ideas of democracy and stuff, and then the religious part, and then the logistical parts where it was, you know, it wasn't like when they created the Constitution, they're like, what, an executive branch? I've never heard of such a thing. Right? I mean, they had experience with this before. I don't know why I like that, but I like it a lot. I like it a lot. Cool.
So really, whether or not you agree or disagree on something shifts your time frame to what kind of evidence you can include, right?
What do you mean?
Like when we were just talking about which was number 3.
Yeah.
Like if you disagree with that, doesn't that like shrink your?
Yeah. Oh no, you're 100% right. Yeah.
Yeah. Like
I mean, you're just going to have to frame your argument differently. You're 100% right. Yeah. And so what happens is you just ignore the other evidence, right?
Yeah, but if you agree, that opens you up to.
Yeah. And probably it will be easier to agree. Sims would have disagreed.
That's when it gets into whether or not you're basing it on what you think. Right?
Yeah, right. And so don't be so ideological. You're like, I think this is wrong. All the other evidence will be easier to prove. I'm going to be harder on myself just to win a non-real argument.
So, saying that, you said that you would disagree with it, didn't you?
At first, but then I talked myself out of that. That happens a lot.
So I
have no
make
real
sure that
firm
evidence is-
theories or hold on to anything that's particularly important, right? I have no real beliefs or principles.
I don't know how we should take that.
One of my best friends always said, I only believe in 3 things, but I believe in those 3 things really strongly. Everything else is open to evidence and suggestion.
Where does he think he believes in?
I don't know, probably God, and he likes his wife quite a bit. I'm sure there's a third one out there. I mean, my point is just that, like, we were talking about politicians. Politicians are like, this is what I believe in here, and here, and here, and here. What if other evidence presents itself and then you look stupid, right? Why shouldn't you say, this is what I believe now, but it might change based on evidence? This is Corey Sayre.
I just kind of jotted down everything you said.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. What's the number?
1543.
Yeah, turn her off.